Sorry, I'm sitting here cracking up at myself. I said, "Welcome to So What," and that we were going to be learning basic sewing techniques. And I said I was going to teach about sewing streams, and I was like, I guess you could sew streams, but sewing seams. So tonight I want to talk about basic sewing, since most of what I've been doing on the stream has been decorative. I wanted tonight to talk about sewing, and I put up my sewing machine, so hopefully when I switched the the when I switch over, you'll be able to see well enough to see what I'm doing, because my space is very limited until I get that figured out. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, because everyone that doesn't know how to sew always asks me, how can you begin to sew? And basically, if you have a sewing machine, can you hear me? Let me know if you can hear me in the chat, because I want to make sure you can hear me and that my music isn't too loud. But basically, I wanted to talk about the different tools that you need. You need a basic sewing machine. Thank you, great. You need a basic sewing machine. The machine that I'm using tonight is ancient. At the time it was state of the art. It's an embroidery machine by Husqvarna, Viking Husqvarna, and it does all of these beautiful stitchings. It embroiders, but now this machine is a dinosaur, and when it quits on me, I won't be able to get it repaired anymore, because they don't even service this machine. But it still sews well. I can still embroider on it. So basically, if you have a sewing machine that was passed down to you, one from your grandmother, one that you found at a thrift shop, because I have found sewing machines from thrift shops. The basic thing, if you find a machine at the thrift shop, you need to make sure that it's sewing properly. If it's just a basic straight stitch zigzag machine, then you can use it. But I would recommend taking it to a sewing machine shop and having them look it over, clean it, oil it, so that you know that you have a machine that's going to work for you. And basically, if it can straight stitch and it can zigzag, you've got yourself a machine that you could make some beautiful things with. So tonight, I am going to I won't be able to show you how to thread the machine, because I don't think you won't be able to see everything that I'm doing. I can talk about it, and I will talk about it, but you won't be able to see me actually thread the machine. But if you purchase a machine, the new machines are going to come with a sewing manual. And I suggest, and I always teach, to learn that sewing machine, and look through the guide, read through the guide, and follow word for word what it's telling you to do. When I teach my students how to sew, that's where we begin. We begin with the sewing manual. Everything you need to know about that machine is going to be in the sewing manual. It's going to talk about stitching, it's going to talk about safety. For example, a safety technique, or not technique, a safety tip that I give my students all the time, and it's something that as adults we do without even thinking about, is never pull the cord by the cord. Always pull the cord out of the socket from the plug, and that's any electronic device, because you will damage the cord, and you could possibly get injured by yanking the cord out of the outlet. So that's tip number one. Number two, when you're sewing, you want to make sure that your hands are away from the needle. The needle is going to be moving up and down, up and down, up and down, and you need to be focused on what you're doing. Now, as you become more experienced in sewing, you can talk and sew, but I never allow my students to talk and sew because inadvertently you can get injured. The sewing machine, the needle can stitch your finger, and yes, it hurts. I did that when I was a teenager, and the needle went straight through my finger, my fingernail and my finger, and I grabbed it immediately. Hey, happy Thursday. And so I grabbed my finger and held onto it and then cried for my dad, Daddy! And he had to actually pull the needle out of my finger with a pair of pliers. And believe it or not, the needle didn't hurt coming out. It was the thread that hurt coming through, being pulled out of my finger. And I have had students who weren't paying attention that sewed their fingers. And so that's something that you want to be mindful of and get in the habit until you're more experienced. I mean, but when you're really sewing, you're really focused, and you should be focused on what you're doing whenever operating a piece of equipment. So again, going back to that sewing manual, you want to read it from start to finish because it's going to tell you everything you need to know. Oh, I'm happy you needed this tonight. But I wanted to tonight focus on some sewing techniques. And these are basic, these are very basic. What I'll probably do is maybe once a month, maybe focus on just basic sewing techniques because sewing is something that you build on. And the more you do it, it's like driving. The more you do it, the better you're going to become at it. And the more confident you're going to feel sewing. And so I do recommend, again, if you buy a machine at the thrift shop, a lot of times they'll have everything that goes with that machine. And if not, if it's a modern machine, you can go online and you can download a copy of the sewing machine manual. So I have a few books that I want to share with you tonight. And is my music okay or is it too loud? Because I feel like I'm yelling over my music and I don't want to do that. So somebody in the chat, let me know if my music is too loud. Okay, great. So the books that I'm going to share, I'll only share if you guys promise not to laugh because they're ancient. And you can also find some of these books at thrift shops, probably Amazon, probably eBay, but they are so good. So the first book I'm going to talk about is this sewing book by Better Homes and Garden. And there's also one, the ancient ones are some of the most authentic, yes, well written books. So this Better Homes and Garden book, there's also one called The Reader's Digest Complete Guide to Sewing. That is a great book to get your hands on. So in this sewing book, and I know this book came from a thrift shop or somebody gifted it to me, but it's ancient. So in this book, it says professional methods to simplify creative sewing and to help you to make clothes with a custom made look for the entire family. So in this book, it has basic sewing equipment. So the things that you're going to need: scissors, needles, bobbins for your machine, straight pins, rulers, tape measures, all a hem gauge. This is a hem gauge that I'm going to show you how to use tonight. Okay, so then it has the commercial pattern. If you're going to be using a commercial pattern, it's going to talk about the size ranges available and body measurements for each size and figure type, which is valuable information on the pattern envelope. Because sometimes people buy patterns and then they don't know how to make it fit themselves. Like one of the mistakes I made when I was sewing, I used to, when I was little, I think probably around 12 years old when I started sewing. I started sewing when I was 5, but I'm saying when I started sewing for people, I didn't, I took measurements, but then I didn't use the measurements. And it's essential when you're sewing with commercial patterns that you take measurements, all the measurements that you will need: the bust measurement, the waist measurement, the hip measurement, the bicep of the arm, the wrist measurement, because you're, if it's a sleeve, you're going to need that information. For a skirt, you're going to need the hip measurement and the waist measurement, and then the length, where you want that skirt to hit you depending on the silhouette of that particular skirt. So all of that information is contained in a commercial pattern. And we can talk about that one day as well. But getting back to the commercial pattern, I would take measurements, but then I wouldn't use the measurements. And then I would, let's say the person said, well, I'm a size 10. Well, then I would make that size 10, but then it wouldn't fit. And the problem is the commercial patterns are sized differently than garments that you, ready-made garments that you buy in a store, a boutique or a department store. Each manufacturer uses a different set of standards for their particular garments. And so when you're using a commercial pattern, you don't worry about the size so much. Worry about the body measurements to make sure that the measurements that you've taken are closely aligned with the measurements in the pattern. But if you're working, let's say, on a blouse, then your main concern is going to be the bust measurement, the waist measurement. The only reason you would be concerned with the hip is if it's a long blouse. Like I have a blouse here. This is a long blouse. If you can see, it's kind of hard. Oops, sorry. You can see the bottom. It's really long. So something like that blouse, you definitely need to include hip measurements. But the pattern is going to tell you all of that. It's also going to tell you what that pattern is suited for. Is it a knit? Is it a woven? Is it a one-way print? Or is, and one way meaning that it's only going to go one direction. So you're going to need extra fabric to cut that garment out, because you're not going to be able to flip pattern pieces to make them fit. So again, this book talks about all of these things. So that's just 2 sections of this, the contents of this book. The next chapter is the alteration pattern. How to make a basic muslin alteration pattern. How you can use it to fit yourself correctly and adjust the pattern for your figure problems. How to alter many special styles of patterns. So that information becomes invaluable. Chapter 4, cutting the dress. Chapter 5, assembling the dress. And there's almost like 20 pages in between each of these chapters that I'm telling you about. Linings and interfacings, professional sewing tips, finishing details. So how are you going to finish the inside of your garment? And we're going to talk about that tonight. Sewing with special fabrics. How to cut, sew, press, and finish, stretch, bonded, and laminated fabrics. Knits, velvet, lace, chiffon, leather, and fake furs. And I'll give you an example, velvet. One of the things that I learned the hard way sewing on velvet was that you can't press velvet with an iron. You will ruin that garment. And as a beginner, I had made my mom a jumpsuit. It was a light blue velvet jumpsuit, and it was gorgeous. I didn't know that I needed what's called a needle board to press the velvet. So I pressed it on the wrong side like you would do a cotton fabric. Well, guess what? It left, it made it blotchy. And I took it to the cleaners. It did help, but I could have ruined the garment. And it still had light and dark spots from where I had ironed the garment. So you don't want to iron velvet. Some of the modern velvet, they've made it so that it can be pressed, but you still have to be careful. And you still need to use a needle board. And I'll show you what a needle board looks like before I end the stream. So moving on, it talks about wardrobe planning, basic dresses and suits and accessories, making lingerie, choosing a becoming hat or handbag, wide choices for buttons and belts, wardrobe planning, and combining separates. So, I mean, this book that I'm talking about, this sounds like a mini college course, all the information that's in here. Chapter 18, Sewing for Your Home. I skipped some too. I'm sorry. Let's see. I skipped professional sewing tips was number 9. Finishing details. Hand stitches for finishing. Sewing with special fabrics. That's where we were talking about the velvet. And then I skipped down to wardrobe planning. So I apologize. So chapter 10 is making sportswear. Different types of skirts, blouses, pants. Chapter 11, evening and dress up fashions. Chapter 12, tailoring the suit. 13, tailoring tricks on coats. Chapter 14, sewing for children. And here's my favorite one. Chapter 15, be your own designer. And they're talking about interchanging pattern pieces and pattern changes, how to figure yardage when changing patterns, surface detail, and color in design, tucking, faggoting, and the mandarin closure. So lots of great stuff. And then I already spoke about the wardrobe planning, ready to wear clothes, which you heard me talk a little bit about. And then the last chapter is sewing for the home. So all of that is included in, I'm sorry, let me see. Maybe if I move back here, you could see. So it's in chapters with pictures and everything. So again, this is Better Homes and Garden. So you could look for that. And then Singer has some great sewing books. They used to come out with these books. I don't know if some of the fabric stores still sell these books, but they had, it was a reference library. And this particular one is just time-saving tips. Like, this is pretty cool. Sewing with a plan. So it's showing you the fabric layout, is showing you the pattern, how many yards of fabric you would need, and your sewing area. These books are going to make me go back and look through them, because to be honest with you, I haven't looked at these books in a very long time, but I refuse to get rid of them. Look at these pictures in here. These are some great books. It's really nice. Sewing with trims. So lots of sewing techniques. And just like you said, Lady Lotus, these are some great books. Look, even like the serger. And for those of you who don't know what a serger is, it's a machine used to clean finish the inside of a garment. So again, it's showing you pattern techniques. So great books. And then the last book that I'm going to show you, and I have plenty more books. Okay, this one definitely came from a thrift shop, and it was $2, and it's called The Bishop Method of Construction. And this is the revised edition. Woo! So, again, the contents are Chapter 1, Sewing Equipment and the Use of the Sewing Machine. Chapter 2, Torn Products. Chapter 3, Buying Patterns Correctly. Chapter 4, Preparing Fabrics for Cutting. Chapter 5, Cutting and Marking. Chapter 6, Making 2 skirts. Chapter 7, Making 2 blouses and a jerkin. I can honestly say I don't even know what a jerkin is, so I'm gonna have to look that up. The Fine Art of Fitting Your Clothes. Chapter 9, Pressing Techniques. And let me tell you, yeah, it's a book to have in your closet. These books sound so interesting. They're gonna make me go back and actually look through them. Pressing techniques. What I was going to say about that, the first time I told one of my students when they were working on their samples to go and press their sample, they were like, "Do what? What are you talking about? Press my clothing?" Because the younger generation know nothing about ironing, pressing their clothes, and that is so sad to me that they don't know those things. And that's what I taught in family and consumer science when I taught middle schools, 7th and 8th graders. Okay, chapter 10 is making a dress. Chapter 11, making a 3-piece ensemble. Chapter 12, tailoring a coat. 13, tailoring a suit. Chapter 14, fabrics suggest their own techniques. Chapter 15, details on clothes for simple elegance in fashion. And there's a glossary on 278 that will talk about the different types of what the words mean actually. And so you see that it lays out so much information in these books. So what I suggest while you're at a thrift shop, or you hate ironing, well, unfortunately, if you're going to sew, you definitely need to have an iron to be able to press, because that is one of the tips about sewing that makes your garment, when it's finished, look professional. Because you can't wait to the end to iron your garment, because there are going to be some places that you can't get the iron into. A steamer a steamer will steam the fabric at the end, but as far as sewing, you're gonna want to have an iron next to your sewing machine, because that's half the battle in making it look professional. And so I do not recommend, unless let's say you're making a pillow, then you're going to stuff the pillow. You can finger press, and I'm going to show you that technique when you're doing something like that. You don't necessarily, you have to iron the fabric before you start sewing on it, but you don't have to um, stop every stitch and press. I would press around the edges and then stuff the pillow, but you don't. It's not as critical as like you're sewing like this collar. When I would, if I sewed this collar, and by the way, I did not make this top, but if you were sewing this collar, you're going to want to press this collar before you attach it to, this is called a neck band. What it's attached, actually, this has a self band. If you can see, it has a self band. Sometimes shirts will have a separate band that the top part of the collar is attached to. So you're going to want to make sure that different things like the cuff of the sleeve, that is pressed. So you're definitely going to have to press. So getting back to my tools. So tonight, because we're just doing basic stuff, I may use some straight pins. I am going to show you how to use a hem gauge. A hem gauge has, this goes from 1 to 6. From 1 to 6. And this little blue thing, I always lose my camera. I'm sorry, guys. This slides up and it slides down. So if I was measuring a hem that I wanted 3 inches, then I'm going to put the blue part on the 3 inches, and then I'm going to measure up 3 inches. And what that does, it just saves me time with keeping the hem straight as I'm getting ready to press up for the hem. So let's get into this. So I have my machine threaded, and what you're looking at right here, like you can't see the whole machine. I have measurements at the bottom. This is my embroidery card. When I'm doing embroidery, if this card is in, and then I have what's off camera you can't see, I have a slot for my card. And you can see it has been through the mill. I have to put some packing tape on it because it's starting to fall apart. And like I said, these are pieces that I can't get anymore. So because this was some type of vinyl, it's cracking. So I'm going to put some tape on it. And on this particular machine, I have woven, stretch, and vinyl settings. And the newer Husqvarnas have all of these things. But this machine, when I first purchased it new, it was $5,000. I got it at a sewing workshop from the company, and they discounted $2,000 off of this machine, and they probably still do things like that because they used it for their demonstration. But I was okay with that. You're gonna take $2,000 off? Great. And I was able to use it to embroider and to do regular stitching. So, and then it does all of these great different stitches. It embroiders. But nowadays, you can get a basic, like I said, you can get a basic sewing machine from Walmart for probably around $159. It's a good starter machine. You can find them. I recommend going to the thrift shop because you can find so many different machines. People, and especially like a good tip is after the holidays, because people buy their men, especially buy their wives machines, and I don't know if they do it so much like they used to. So either they'll update their wife's machine and buy them a new one, and so then they'll get rid of the old one, or they'll buy it for their wife, thinking that they're gonna sew. That, or they say, "Oh, I want to learn to sew," and then 6 months later they decide, you know what? It's cheaper for me to go in the store and go buy what I want. So I don't want this machine anymore. So keep your eyes out. Thrift shops, great machines. So let's talk about fabric. Let's talk about fabric. So this is a piece of muslin. And what I do with muslin is I make basic patterns out of muslin. Muslin used to be very inexpensive to make a pattern. If you buy a commercial pattern, let's say you're making a dress for yourself, and it's cotton, it's not knit, and you want to make sure that you've worked out all the kinks of that garment before actually making it into this beautiful fabric that you spent $12, $15 a yard for. Muslin usually costs around $4 a yard. It used to be like $1. Now you could get it on sale for with a coupon, maybe for half off. But it's a great cotton fabric. Muslin is a cotton fabric that is used to create patterns, and you can mark on muslin, you can write on it, which is what I do when I take measurements on somebody. When I make my corrections, I'll write on top of the muslin and make corrections on it. I don't know if you could see that, but I'll correct my seams and things with muslin. So, with that being said, on any fabric, you are going to have your seam, your selvage. This is the selvage of the fabric. Selvage runs parallel to the lengthwise grain of the fabric. The lengthwise grain on fabric stretches the least. It does, because that's the most stable, grain on your fabric. The next grain I'm going to talk about is the cross grain, and I'm going to write that right on this fabric. I'm writing cross grain. It's not being kind to me. I'm trying to make the O. It's called the crosswise grain. So I'm gonna just, oops, I might have moved my camera. I may have to adjust my camera before we sew. But the crosswise grain on fabric is perpendicular to the lengthwise grain. So I'm gonna mark that on this fabric. And this is important when you're making patterns. So that's the crosswise grain right here. And it stretches a little. If you can see, it's stretching a little. Whereas, like I said, the lengthwise grain, it doesn't stretch. It doesn't stretch at all. So then the next grain I'm going to talk about, which if you take the cross grain and the lengthwise grain and you make the lengthwise grain parallel. Let me see if I could do this. I'm going to fold it on the table so you can see. So what I did was I made the lengthwise grain parallel. I'm going to move it up a little so you can see that it's parallel. So if you make it parallel to the crosswise grain, What you're going to get over here in the corner is bias. And if you can see, that is stretching. The bias grain of the fabric, I'm going to put a finger press in it. Bias stretches the most on a woven fabric. So I'm just, my space right here is so limited, so I'm trying to draw lines for you. I'll do a better one, a sample, so that we have that. So if you can remember that, let's see. If you can remember that, this is the crosswise grain. This is the lengthwise grain, which is parallel to the woven, the finished edge of the fabric, or the lengthwise grain. And then when you fold the lengthwise grain, you make it parallel to the crosswise grain, you're going to get bias. Why is that important? Let's say you had a pattern and you were making, like right now in fashion, the slip dress is popular. A true slip dress is made on bias. The pattern actually is laid out so that it's on the side. So true bias, you might see a seam because if it's wide, if the dress is wide, like in the olden days, you would see a seam at the bottom of that dress. That's because the fabric wasn't wide enough for the dress, but it's just gonna drape beautifully. When you get an opportunity, Google on YouTube a bias cut dress. I haven't Googled that, but I'm sure there should be something out there. You are going to see how beautiful that dress fits. Nowadays, they don't do that because it takes too much fabric, and then you have to actually wait for that dress to drape properly, to hang. Like before you finish the edge of the hem, it needs to hang for a couple of days because bias stretches. And if you took a length, what's called a length, the hem of the dress, if you measured all around the bottom with a measuring guide or a hem guide to draw around the edge of the hem line, you're going to find if you did that the first day, then after you wear it, you're going to say, why is my hem uneven? It's because it continued to hang and drape. And so it's real important to understand the grains. If your pattern says cut this piece on the lengthwise grain, you need to know that you need to cut it on the lengthwise grain. If it has cut on the fold, what does that mean? It means that your fabric needs to be folded, but it needs to be straight. It needs to be straight. So you can't have part of the lengthwise grain on an angle, because then your dress is not going to fit properly. All of those things are important for the fit of your garment. You cannot shortcut those things when you're sewing. So what we're going to do, before I go back, like I said, I wanted to talk to you. Let's say you were cutting out a garment, and this has happened to me many times, where you need one little piece and they don't have any more of that fabric at the fabric store, but you need one more piece for to cut, let's say the cuffs out. And you had a piece of fabric, but the cuff said to cut on the lengthwise grain. Let's say we didn't have this finished edge. How would you know? How would you know which grain you're dealing with? By doing the simple technique that I just showed you, you're going to be able to say, oh, let's say it was this piece, this edge, and you didn't know. Let's see, is this the lengthwise grain? Let's see. I think that's the lengthwise grain. Is this the lengthwise grain? Oh no, this can't be the lengthwise grain because it's stretching a little. The crosswise grain stretches a little. So this has to be the lengthwise grain. So now you know on this remnant piece of fabric, you know where your grain is without having this finished edge. You don't need that. It helps, but let's say you didn't have it available to you. Now you know how to find the different grain lines on your fabric. So what I'm going to do, I have cut out some squares. I've cut out some squares. And, oh, before I do that, because one of the things that I did with my students before I'm going to unthread my machine. One of the things I did with my students is I would have them on day one so that they got control of the machine. If you've never sewn before, this is for you. Of course, if you're advanced or you've sewn before, then you don't have to do this. But this is to help people to feel more confident when they're just starting out to sew. So I would teach them to take a notebook piece of paper, and then I would just have them to stitch. And if you notice, I'm not pulling on, because a lot of times students have a tendency to do this, to pull on the fabric. You don't need to do that. Your feed dog, and those are the parts of the machine which I go over in a beginner sewing class. I teach you the different parts of your machine because you need to know what's going on with the machine. But I teach them to hold their hands out here, and basically all you're doing is guiding the machine. And when you get to the end, and I'll do it on the fabric, we're going to backstitch. But for this, we're not going to backstitch. So I just teach them, you put your needle down into the fabric, and then you start stitching. And I'm stitching right on the line of this notebook paper. I'm not pulling, I'm not tugging, because if you're pulling and tugging when you start sewing, you're going to cause your seams to pucker. And you want to be right on top of that line. So this is mimicking straight stitching. So I'm only going to do 3, but when they're in class, I have them to do more than 3 rows. So, and then like it's funny, they look at it and they say, "Oh, I can tear that off." So I'm gonna thread my machine. My machine is threaded. I'm just gonna put it back in the needle so that I can stitch the straight stitch. And you might be asking, "Oh, this is so basic." It is basic, but guess what? You're going to use straight stitching for everything you sew. You're going to use straight stitching. These squares are 6 by 6. I usually would have my students do 8 by 8 squares because I wanted them to get the hang of it. So the first thing you're going to do, you're going to always start with your presser foot down, and that's going to keep your machine from your fabric from moving. And let's just say this was the side of a skirt. This was the side of a blouse or a jacket seam. So you're going to stitch a couple of stitches, and then you're going to back stitch. And then you're going to stitch, keep stitching. I'm not pulling on the fabric. When I get to the end, I'm going to back stitch. And then I'm going to cut my thread. The cool thing is some of the newer machines, they actually cut. I have a machine, a brother machine that actually cuts the thread. Like I hit a button, click, and it cuts the thread. That's so cool. So what I'm doing and what I usually have my students do is stitch a press a foot width. I stitch a couple of stitches and then I back stitch. And then I'm watching what I'm looking at. My eye is looking at the edge of the press a foot next to the stitch that I just did. Now this could be decorative stitching on a garment that you do this way. And so you want to make sure you control the machine. And again, and I'm only stitching about, I would say 3/8 of an inch at the end for the back stitch. And the reason why we back stitch at the end of the seam is so that it doesn't come apart. So again, I put my sewing machine press a foot right at the edge of that stitch, and it's butted right next to that stitch. And as you see, I'm not putting any tension on the fabric. So again, with my students, I have them to stitch an entire square. They have to stitch an entire square. So this is what that looks like. So when I teach, I have them finish the whole entire piece. And what that is doing, what that does is it helps you to gain control of the machine. So then the next thing I'm going to do, and again, you're going to straight stitch everything. You're going to straight stitch. Hey, thanks. You're going to straight stitch everything. You're going to if you want to make a pillow, that's 4 straight stitches. This could have been a pillow. And I'm going to show you how it could have been a pillow when I do square stitching. This could be the side of a skirt. It could be the side of a jacket. It could be the front of a blouse. So the next thing we're going to do, I am going to straight stitch. I'm going to do square stitching, and how I have my students to do that. We start the same way. Your press a foot, you're always going to start with the press a foot down in the machine. And on this machine, I have an arrow where my needle can end up or it'll end down in the fabric. So I'm going to start, I'm going to stitch a little, and then I'm going to stitch. And again, my press a foot is lined up with the edge of the fabric. When I get close to the end, I'm gonna stop. Sometimes you have to walk the needle down, and I'll show you because I'm gonna do that when I get to the end. Oh, let me go back and talk about what I just did. My needle is in the down position, and this technique, if you were sewing a pocket or the corner of a collar, the corner of a cuff of a blouse, the needle is in the down position. Lift up on the press-a foot. With the needle in the down position, you swing the fabric around, and then I'm going to stitch. And again, I'm using the edge of the fabric as my guide. When I get close to the end, I'm going to walk that needle down because I want it a press-a-foot width. Then you're going to turn the corner and you're going to stitch. You notice we didn't back stitch in these corners because let's say if you were doing a pocket, you're not going to back stitch at the end of your square. You want that to be pretty. So now that I'm getting to the end, I'm going to walk my needle down, put my needle in the down position, make sure the edge of my press-a-foot is at the edge of the straight stitch of the fabric. So now I'm going to stitch. And again, if you notice, I am not pulling on this fabric. I'm letting the feed dog in the machine pull the fabric back. And I'm only sewing. And do you control the speed? I control the speed with this, with this, the controller. This is like the gamer controller, but yeah, with the foot control pedal. That's what that is. That's how I'm controlling the machine. Some of the newer machines that I bought for my students when I teach sewing classes, it has a little lever where I can make it really fast or make it slower. This machine too, I have it set at full speed. I'm gonna slow it up. I'm controlling the speed when it's at full speed, but now I lowered my speed on the sewing machine. Let's see how far it's gonna, how much it's gonna go. And I think I can walk my foot down a little because I want that presser foot right at the edge of that stitch. Okay, now this is as fast as it's gonna go. I'm pushing hard on this machine, and that's as fast as it's going to go. Okay, so now I'm gonna move it back a little because I want it to be square. I want that to be perfectly square. So then I'm going to stitch. And this is just helping, again, to gain control of the machine. And because I have this machine set, the more expensive machines do have better control of different, they have different features that you don't find on less expensive machines. Yes, you step on it like a gas pedal, just like you control a car with your gas pedal. You control the sewing machine with the foot control. And so that comes with practice. In the beginning, most people learning how to sew don't control the machine well because it's new. It's like driving a car. But once you get used to it, the commercial machines that they use in the factory, those things scream, they're so fast. So again, if you notice, I'm pushing up the presser foot. Some of the commercial machines have a foot control that lifts up the presser foot, and so it's a continuous motion. So then we keep sewing. And when I'm teaching a basic beginning sewing class, this is essentially what I have my students doing, because I'm cheating here because I wanted to move that stitch back because I wanted exactly a presser foot width. So my students would get graded on samples. This might take an entire period. Our periods in school were around 47 minutes. They would have around, I would say, 35 minutes to sew because then they had to clean up. And when I teach sewing now, I do it in at least 2-hour increments because by the time you get started, you don't want to end. So again, you can see where this could be decorative stitching on a garment that would be really pretty. And by the way, if I were sewing a real garment, I would not be using black thread on cream fabric unless it was a stitch detail. I would be using the color of the fabric. I'm just doing this so that it shows up on stream. So if you, I don't know if you can see that it's not exactly on the edge. So that's when I go back, walk my needle down a little, and then turn. But you always want to make sure that needle is down so that your corners come out beautiful. You don't want to skip thread. So leaving it, making sure it's in the fabric and it's not going anywhere. That's how you ensure that you're going to get that crisp edge. The older machines, the press-a-foot was a true 1/4 inch seam. So when you're trying to sew like a collar or something that you needed a 1/4 inch stitch, that's what you would do. So I'm not gonna do this whole piece of this whole sample, but I will tell you that the closer you get to the center of this sample, the harder it's going to get. And that's where you learn to control the machine. And that's basically what I have all of my students do, because that's going to help them to learn how to control the machine. And these are techniques that if you're wanting to make a quilt, basically you need to know how to do this one thing, just to be able to stitch around just like this. And you want the stitches as straight as possible. Maybe I will finish this one, just so that you can see. The kids used to love doing this one. And they would be so proud of it, but they would get graded on these samples like this. As if I knew they could do this, then I knew that they could make their drawstring pouch. They could make a pair of pants. They could make pockets. They could do whatever they wanted to do. And so it's not a waste to do this. It just helps you, like I said, to gain control of the machine. I'm going to cheat and walk that back a bit because I went just a little too far. And I'm going to turn it. So it's better to walk it in once you get close to the end. And when you start getting, this gets tighter and tighter and tighter, you have to stop and walk it in, because you will overshoot it. And the point of the whole exercise is to help you learn how to gain control. If you were sewing, like I said, a pocket or a collar, a cuff, the edge of, let's see, a belt, that would be, this is good for as well. And again, the smaller the square gets, the harder it is to control keeping that width. And again, I am not pulling on the fabric. I'm just simply stitching like a maze. That's what this ends up looking like. And you see, the closer it gets to the end, we're going to go all the way to the end on this until I can't go anymore. But you see, I'm running out of room. So I'm stopping more frequently to get that needle down and into the fabric. And this is the last one I'm going to be able to do. And so I'm going to back stitch at that last stitch. And you want to always make sure your needle is down. So this is what we did. So that's the square that I made, and that just shows control of the machine. And believe it or not, when I was in high school, this is what we had to do. So We did square stitching. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. I lost my light, and I do need my light, so let me clip it back. It's being hard-headed. Okay, hopefully. Okay, that's better. I hope. Okay, so we did square stitching. We did straight stitching. My sewing machine is almost 30. It's super heavy, but I love it. This machine is just about 30 minutes too. Thank you for chatting with me. But yeah, some of the older machines, they don't make them like they used to. So I tell people, don't throw away your machines. Just get them serviced if you can, and they are going to treat you well. So the next thing we're going to talk about, so I have my students do straight stitching, square stitching, then they do circular stitching. I didn't cut a circle, so we're not going to do circular stitching, but you would think circular stitching was just as easy as square stitching, but it takes time controlling going around in a circle. And so I have them to do that exercise because it just helps them. Again, what my goal is to get the student to feel comfortable with the machine and with stitching, and to make sure both sides of this sample looks pretty. And that's how you know your machine, the stitching is good, because you want your bobbin side to look just as pretty as your upper thread. And just a rule of thumb, let's say my stitching didn't look nice on both sides, then I would troubleshoot. And the way you troubleshoot is, if the bottom stitch doesn't look right, then something is wrong with your tension at the top, and vice versa. If the top doesn't look right on the fabric, then it's your bobbin. Maybe your bobbin needs to be tightened or adjusted. Maybe it could be bad thread. Maybe try a different thread, because the better threads, like the thread I'm sewing with, is Gutermann. Gutermann is one of the best threads, because the filament is very, very stable. When you look at less expensive thread, like I have a spool of less expensive thread, you're gonna see the difference. So this is less expensive thread. Okay. Can you see the difference? Let me see if I can pull out the Gutermann. So the bottom one, the bottom thread is the Gutermann, and the top one is the one that you can get in the bins for like $1 or something. So I don't use these threads. I don't use these inexpensive threads to stitch a nice garment. I might base something with it so that I'm not wasting my Gutermann, because a basting stitch, you're basically going to take out. So if you want your garment to look nice, you got to start from the beginning. So the next thing we're going to talk about is seam finishes. If you have a serger, that's great, because a serger is going to clean finish the inside seam of a garment. And so that's what a serger does. And again, I have purchased sergers even at the thrift shop. I used to have a thrift shop. It was the Humane Society thrift shop. And I got so close to the manager that anytime he got in any type of sewing equipment, he would call me up because my studio was like walking distance. And he would even let me try it out and and then take it to my studio, play around with it to see if I wanted it. I purchased machines from him, like sewing machines, sergers, embroidery machines, art lights that cost so much money. I would purchase from him. I love going in there. They've moved now, so I'm like sad. But okay, let me go back. Let me thread my machine again because I took it out. And again, I could show you threading the machine, because sometimes getting back to troubleshooting, if your machine isn't sewing properly, take the bobbin out and make sure that the bobbin is incorrectly. You gotta serge a second hand. Yes. Did you get a manual with it? Because what happens with, have you used a serger before? Are you new to a serger, or have you used a serger before? Let me know if you've used it. If you've not used a serger before, what I suggest is taking the manual, rethreading that machine. Pretty new, but it was working 4 thread until the needle broke. Okay, what I recommend you doing is, if you have the book to that machine, if you don't have the book, go online and see if you can download the manual. Because what happens sometimes with sergers are notorious for, like, if the thread is um, crossed over in the looper, it won't sew properly and your stitching is not going to look good. Sometimes with a serger, let's say you use, if it's a 4 thread serger and one of your cones of thread, and I did have a cone of thread here somewhere. Okay, your cone of thread, this happens to be Joann's brand, but like I said, I like Gutermann. Let's say you had 3 Gutermann and this one spool of Joann thread. Sometimes it won't sew right because of this one thread. So before you take it to the machine, take it to the shop to have it serviced, change the thread. Make sure all 4 threads are the same. Make sure the looper threads on the bottom, the loopers, those are the ones in the bottom that move back and forth. Make sure those the thread isn't crossed over. Do all of those things first. Rethread it, because you'll find that sometimes when the needle breaks, it gets thrown off for whatever reason. And also your tensions, make sure your tensions are at the same setting. And a lot of times with a serger, honestly, sometimes you just have to play around with the knobs, the tensions, because if it's off by a hair, the thread isn't going to, the stitch isn't going to look good. But that's where that manual comes in handy, because the manual is going to tell you, set yellow to this number, to 5, set green to 3. depending on the type of stitch that you're doing. So that's what I recommend for your serger. uh, it it's four threads but three thread function. Yeah, you could do four threads or you could do three threads. That's great that you can do that depending on how you want that seam to lay is usually when I determine whether or not I want three threads, four threads. I even have one machine that does five threads, so it just depends on what you want. So I'm threading the machine, and sometimes to get the needle where it needs to be, especially with black, I have to put the presser foot down in the down position. And this machine, the thread goes to the back. With some of the older machines, I have a machine at my studio, it threads this way. And so it just depends. But when you start stitching, make sure both of your threads are under the presser foot. So let's say this was my side seam to that blouse, and I have on the throat plate here, I have 1, 2, 3. Well, I etched in a 5/8, a half an inch, because this second line right here, this second line, that's 5/8 of an inch. Anytime I sew with a commercial pattern, I cut my pattern down to half inches. In when you make professional patterns, you usually use a half an inch. Sometimes you use an inch. And years ago, when a garment was well made, like a skirt or something like that, they would leave inch seams because that was more professional. That was more couture, where you had room to let it out. And so, but for my preference, when I'm sewing a seam, I only want a half an inch. And so if this was a seam that was half an inch, then I'm going to do, like I said, put my needle in the down position. I'm going to back stitch, and then I've etched out a half an inch so that this seam is a half an inch. And a question someone might be asking is, do I use straight pins on the seam? If it's a cotton fabric, then I'm going to sew it like I just did freehand. Now, if this was a seam on, if this was my seam on a blouse, I'm going to go to the iron and I'm going to press this seam. That's just a straight seam. It's called a plain seam. What do you use a plain seam? OMG, so I didn't read the pattern instructions, seam allowance, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but we've all done it. I've done it because it wanted 5/8 inches, and I usually work at a quarter, 3/8 inch. That's a good point, because if you know what your preference is, before you even cut that garment out, use a ruler. This is they call it a quilting ruler, and you can see mine is pretty beat up, but I use this ruler to change seam allowance, like, because it's in increments of 1/8 of an inch increments, and then the deeper lines are half inch markings and inch markings. And so my recommendation is to go throughout that pattern. It takes time, but I recommend, especially like around a collar, you only want a quarter of an inch. On a cuff, the cuff of a sleeve, you only want, in that seam allowance, you only want a quarter of an inch. Um, Definitely you want at least a half an inch for your armhole seam and your side seams. But if you're going to, definitely when you're sewing in a sleeve, OMG, 5/8 of an inch is way too big. No more than a half an inch is needed for a sleeve, else it can be difficult to sew in. So going back to this seam, so this would be a plain seam. What would I use a plain seam for? I'm going to show you. I have this little baby, this is a jumper that I'm making, and you can see that I did not clean finish the edge of the seam, and that's because I have two pieces, the front and the back is already sewn together. So those are the seams. So that's the back, and these two loose pieces are the front of this little jumper. And I have the same thing for the inside. This is actually going to be the inside of the garment. And so what's going to happen is these pieces, now this is where I would use straight pins, because I want to make sure that my seams line up. I can't stand when seams don't line up. So I am going to put those seams together, and I'm going to straight pin the edge together to make sure my seams line up when I stitch them. Can you see that? Where they would be lined up. So that would be the use of, again, this plain stitch where I'm not gonna serge, because that's gonna be sandwiched in between that garment, and you want it as flat as possible. Now, if that didn't have a lining, then yes, I'm going to do some type of seam finish. So the next seam, and I've lost my fabric, y'all. Oh, here it is. Okay, so the next seam I'm going to do a plain seam, but then I'm going to show you if you didn't have a serger, what you could do. I used to do this when I was in high school and I had to sew my garments at home and I didn't have a serger. And I could put my speed back up too. So again, I back stitch, and I'm stitching a half an inch. If I went all the way to that etched in line, that would be 5/8 of an inch, and I don't want a 5/8 inch seam. Okay, so instead of, and make sure your tail is long enough, because when your tail isn't long enough, your thread is going to keep pulling out of your needle, and that has got to be one of the most frustrating things ever, to have to keep doing that. So now, if this was my garment and I did not have a serger, this machine has something that looks like a zigzag, like a serger thread. I'm trying to figure out, okay, it's this one. Okay, so then I would use this machine. Now, the thing that I hate, let me go back, let me take this out, because it's crunching up the edge of my seam, and even if I didn't have a serger, I wouldn't want that to happen. So let me try this again. I'm gonna try further in to see what happens. Okay, it's still crunching it up. So honestly, I would not use this because I don't like, I'm gonna show you what it looks like. I don't like that. So I don't like that stitch. I would never use that. So again, I'm going to take that out, and I'm going to use just a plain zigzag stitch. So I'm pulling that out, and I'm going to show you the same thing with a zigzag stitch. And I'm going to make that about 3 inches. Not 3 inches, the width about a 3 stitch length. Okay, so before I had a serger when I was in high school, this is what I did. So what this is going to do is finish off that edge, and then what I used to do when I was in high school, it was so frustrating. I would put fray check on the edge, and then I would cut close to that zigzag stitch. Having a serger is, oh my gosh, it's a deal. It's a what do you call it, a godsend. But I actually had to do this when I was in school. So it's a way that you could clean finish the edge of a plain stitch. And then of course I would press this in one direction, usually towards the side seam, towards the back. And then I trimmed the edge on that. But a serger is so much nicer. So this is what the serger seam looks like. So thankfully I don't have to do that anymore. And so I feel for people who still have to clean finish that way. So that's one way that you could do a seam. I'm gonna go back to regular stitching, and I am going to do what's called a French seam. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to put an X, which is going to represent the wrong side. So I'm going to put the X. So when you're stitching a French seam, and the reason you would use a French seam is because you have a silk fabric. Okay, so my X is in the wrong place. I want to make sure I set this up for you properly. So my X, I want both the right sides together. I want the right side of the garment. We're stitching from the outside first. So right side, right side. And you can see my seam that I already did. So right side to right side. You want to stitch that together. And again, we are making a French seam. And a French seam, you want to use a French seam on silk. Does the zigzag work on the same idea? Yes. And I do have a pair of Pinkin shears. I don't see them just yet, but maybe on another string I'll find them. I had lost my Pinkin shears. Oh, hold on one second. I think I know where my Pinkin shears might be. No, I'm wrong. I'll find them and show them, because some people don't know what Pinkin shears are. But yes, the zigzag stitch works for the same premise as the zigzag stitch. Okay, so I have right sides together. Now I'm not going to stitch a 1/2 inch because I still need to be able to put the stitch in that's going to, I want to stitch 1/4 of an inch because I'm going to have to flip it over and I'm going to have to stitch it again. So a French seam is a stitch within a stitch, and it sandwiches it together. So I'm going to stitch it 3/8 of an inch. Oh, let me put it back on straight stitch. Okay, and my needle is going to be in the down position. I am going to stitch and then back stitch, and then I'm going to show you this seam when I get to it. Anytime you want your seams to look pretty, for like you're going to see it on a sheer fabric like a chiffon, an organza, that's where you're going to use. So right now I've stitched 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to trim. Well, first, before I trim, this is a good trick. Go ahead and press that seam open. Stitch it, press it open, and I'm using my fingers because I don't have room for my iron. So I've pressed it open with my fingers. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this really, really close, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. And I know if you've never done a French seam, you're wondering, why did you stitch it on the right side? Because you want it to end up on the wrong side of the garment. So that's what it looks like. So this is the wrong side, which looks like the right side. Remember the X? So that's the wrong side. Okay, so now I'm going to, if I had my iron here next to me, I would press it, which is what I'm doing with my fingernails. Now I am going to fold this over, and I'm going to stitch it 1/4, actually 1/8, because I want this to be a small French seam. Because again, if this was on a sheer garment, I want it to look really, really nice. So I'm going to back stitch, and then sometimes I'll grab the tail if it seems like it's hard to stitch. Now at the end, I kind of went off a bit, and I would, if this was a garment, I would fix that because I don't want it to. Let's see how I did, and I'm going to show you why I said I would redo the bottom a little, because on a French seam you don't want any of the seam to show. This is the right side, but if you look closely, you see that little bit of fabric. You want it to look like the middle, where there's no, you might have a thread that you have to pull or cut. Sometimes that happens, but you don't want any of the fibers showing in your seam. So I would press this. So there's my outside, and then that's what it looks like on the inside. Remember the X? So this is the inside. See how pretty that looks? If that was a sheer garment, then that's what you're going to see. You're not going to see a serge stitch. You're going to see a really pretty stitch seam, and it's a durable seam. More of the needle. I will try It's kind of hard. I'm scared to even touch this. Is that good? Is that better? It's kind of hard because like this camera is like right in my face. But I will try. So there the we have the plain stitch seam, we have a zigzag seam. I showed you on the garment what a serge seam looked like, and then we have a French seam. So now let's talk about a flat fell seam, like a pair of jeans. Now I'm gonna do two. I'm gonna do a mock flat fell seam, and then a real flat fell seam. So I'm taking two pieces of fabric together, and I'm going to stitch my 1/2 inch seam again. And again, I'm not pulling on the fabric. I am just stitching. And I back stitched. Okay, so now to create a fake, I'm going to create a fake flat fell stitch. I am going to trim one of my seams. I don't know if you can see this, but I'll show it to you. I'm going to cut part of the seam off. And by the way, I'm going to show you my real scissors. I love Gingher scissors. They're some of the best. So if you can see that, I cut the seam. This one is the regular width, and then I cut this one close to it. So now I'm gonna fold, and before I and actually I could have actually done this one on the outside too, so that it mocks a flat fell seam. But this could be on the inside of the garment or the outside. And again, pressing it makes it so nice, but I'm just using my fingers for right now. So that's what it looks like on the inside. And then I'm going to go back and my needle, I'm making sure my thread doesn't pull out. Like I said, that is so frustrating. And if I'm not careful, I'll break my needle. And goodness, I don't know where my stash of needles are, so I don't want to break a needle tonight. So now I'm stitching right on that edge. Always back stitching because I don't want the seam to come out, and making sure this is flat. So I'm stitching right next to the edge of where I folded the fabric under. So a flat fell seam is used, as we know, on the side seams of like a pair of jeans. It's usually a very sturdy seam, just like a French seam. It's very sturdy. So this is what it looks like. And of course, if I was doing this on a garment, I would take that out because it's crooked. But as you can tell, it looks like a flat fell seam, but that's really a mock flat fell seam. Because on this side, which is the outside, you just have a single stitch. And a flat fell stitch, you're going to have the 2 rows of stitching, and I don't like that. my thread got caught in the end. And so anytime you're sewing, things like that are things that you need to take out when you're sewing. Sewing can be very tedious, but you want your finished garment to look nice. So if I wanted to mock this on the outside, I could go back again now and stitch on the outside next to that seam to make it look like a flat fell seam. And a lot of times when I do this, I might do this using a double needle. Double needles are really cool, and they do a lot. On knits, they're great because I mock having a flat fell, not flat fell, the seam on a knit, the machine, because that's a different type of serger that does that type of finish, like you see on t-shirts, the around the neckline, or you might see it on a sleeve. One side looks like it's serged, the other side looks like it's just double stitched. So that's, it gives the appearance of being a flat fell seam, but it's not. And so but it's a very durable seam. So those are some seams that you could do depending on what you're trying to do on your garment. But again, most of the time with ready to wear now, it's usually a serged seam. Like when I do children's wear, this is a skirt. This is basically, this is the skirt of the little jumper dress that I'm making. And I've used, this is a 5-threader because it actually did the straight stitch and the serge stitch at the same time. And that's why you see that stitch at the bottom too, because it did the serged edge and the straight stitch. And again, you can see that it looks nice. It looks nice on both sides. So right now I can't think of any seam. Basically, those are the seams. If I had my serger out, I would show you the serger, but I just don't have enough room in here to have the computer and my sewing machine and this light that's in my way. But I am going to be right back. I am going to look for my green thread, change the bobbin. I'll look for the thread. I'll do the change the bobbin on camera so that you can see that. You can't see the machine, but at least I can describe what I'm doing. So go get some water. I'll be right back. sorry. I always forget to unmute myself. But I do not have um, an empty bobbin in here. So, but it's better not to wind thread on top of a bobbin. It's better to take it out. It helps for a clean stitch. But to save time, I am gonna wind this green thread on this bobbin that I was using. And again, I'm only doing that to save time. So this machine has a bobbin winder on the side. So I am going to wind the bobbin with some green thread, because you want your thread to be the same on the top as it is on the bottom. Unless you're doing, sometimes I do one color on the bottom and one color on the top if I'm stitching something that requires that. So again, we talked about checking your bobbin. And this bobbin, if you look closely, if I needed to tighten it, which I have done, that little the little screw, let me get it, the little screw, if you use your little tiny screwdriver, that's how you can tighten this bobbin. So I'm just going to go ahead and thread my bobbin. And this particular bobbin, when you put a bobbin in, you should be able to do like that and the bobbin not fall out. If your bobbin falls out, you're not going to get a good stitch. So you need to, whatever bobbin you're using for your machine, you need to have it so that when you're getting ready to insert it, it's completely in the bobbin case. Some machines now, the bobbin case is in the throat plate, but this particular one is not. A lot of the older machines, they are not. But your thread, your stitch will not look right if your bobbin is not in. If you don't hear it click when you put that bobbin in, then you're gonna have a problem. Okay, so now I'm just going to thread my machine. I'm gonna take this bobbin off, and this big cone of thread is Madeira. So I like Madeira. I like Gutermann. I like, those are really nice sewing threads. Gutermann also, I use, not Gutermann, Madeira. I use Madeira for my embroidery threads when I'm doing embroidery. And again, this machine is an older Viking Husqvarna, and it is an embroidery straight stitch machine. When you are threading your machine, if you have a problem threading it, then I recommend, I'm trying to get it in the camera so you can see it. There it is. I cut it at an angle. If you lick it, you're going to cause that thread to swell, and you're never going to get it through the needle. So I've pulled it through. Oops, it twisted, so I'm fixing that. And I'm making sure. Now this machine, the older machines, you had to put the needle down and pull up to get that loop on the bottom to get your thread to come to the surface. The newer machines, you don't have to do that. And then you always want to make sure your thread is behind you. So what has already happened on this little skirt part of this little girl's dress is I've already serged the back, and then I already pressed up the hem where I want it to be. And the front, because I took this off because I didn't like the way it looked, it does have the buttonholes. I don't recommend you doing buttonholes before your garment is completely finished. But in this case, the buttonholes are up there because it was already, I took it apart. So I'm going to show you how to do a gathered stitch. To how do we make this whole long piece gathered into a skirt? So now I am going to set my stitch length to 4 because I want to be able to pull the threads. So I am going to stitch a 1/2 inch, and I'm just controlling the machine. I am not pulling the thread like I said before. And I see that I'm just going to clip that little piece there. No. Okay. So because my machine is older, sometimes it does that. But I'm going to see if I can keep going. Hopefully it'll let me keep going, but sometimes when it does that, okay. And that's because it's electronic, and sometimes because it's older, it misses a stitch like that. But I am going to keep stitching, and hopefully it's not going to bother this gathering stitch that I was making. I'll just pull it from the other side if it does. But there's nothing I can do about it. It's at the end of its life, and they already told me at Viking that they would not service it any longer. So I just deal with it, and hopefully it doesn't do something like that again. Okay, I leave a long enough thread tail because that's what I'm going to use to pull to gather this. Okay, again, my thread is in the back. Now I am going to put, like, remember when we were doing the straight stitching and I lined the edge of the press-a-foot up with the stitch? That's what I'm going to do now, but on the opposite side. And if you notice, I did not back stitch because I want to be able to pull those threads. If I back stitch, I'm not going to be able to pull the stitch. Come on, machine. That would be awful if my machine quit on me tonight. I'm already prepared. Like, if it quits, then I'm going to say my goodbyes and move along. I have other machines, but I like this machine. It is not, it's acting crazy. It's like skipping. Not really skipping, but like jerking. Like it used to be so smooth. I may get a commercial machine, I don't know. Because I love commercial machines. They are so much faster, and you get faster as you're stitching. I did it again. Right at the end. You know how sometimes you have company and your kids would show out? That's what this machine is doing to me right now. It's saying, I'm going to be bad. Okay, let's see if I can get it to... So, what I did, I stitched... Let's see if I can show that. I stitched 2 rows of almost like a basting stitch. And now I'm going to grab the bobbin stitch, not the top stitch. And let me make sure, for those who have never did a gathering stitch, you cannot pull both sides of the thread. If you do, you're going to lock the thread. So it's real important that you only pull, you see I have the 2 bobbin threads. The 2 top needle threads are still on the surface. If you see, those are the front, in the front. This is the bobbin thread. And I'm going to start to pull and gather. So do you see how that's gathering in? So I'm going to see if I could do that under the camera. Let me see if I can adjust the camera there. Okay. So again, I'm only pulling, and I wrap it around my finger, and I pull. And you pull gently, because nothing is worse than doing a gathering stitch and your thread breaks, and then you have to start all over again. So I wrap it around my finger as I'm gathering. And I'm gently pulling on the thread. There's another trick that you can use. Now that area where my machine acted crazy, I don't think it's gonna let me gather past that stitch, and I'm gonna have to pull from the inside though on the other side, because it made almost, if you look in the corner, let's see, right here, it's preventing me, right here is preventing me from that stitch. It almost locked it in. So what I'm going to do is pull from the other side, and if I can't get it to go further than that, then guess what? I'm gonna have to restitch that whole part over again. So basically what I'm doing is I'm going to go to the other side and pull the bobbin thread from that side. I am not going to pull it from the front, because if I pull it from the front, like I said, it's going to lock that stitch, and I don't want it locked. So I'm using a straight pin to make sure I have the front pulled to the front and the bobbin pulled to the back, so that when I start pulling the thread to gather it, I only have the back thread. So that's what I'm doing. Sometimes, like, this is thread in between. I wish you could see what I'm doing. To make sure that I have the bobbin thread. And it's okay if it's not right on the end, because I don't want it to be right on the end when the gather's right on the end. Okay, so I got the bobbin thread where I can just start to pull the bobbin thread like I did before. So I'm wrapping it around my finger. And again, I'm pulling, but I'm gently pulling because it could pop. And that has happened to me on many occasions where I had to take it out and start all over again. Now there are attachments for serger machines that will gather like this to pull your thread in, or to gather the fabric. But I think it's really pretty. If you're gonna go through the trouble of making it handmade, then I say it's worth pulling your gathers yourself, because to me they're prettier than those feet. I have a foot called a gathering foot, and this is what it does, but to me it's not as pretty as when I've gathered it by hand. So that's what it looks like. So there's the little skirt. So you saw that big piece turn into this little skirt. It's so cute. So that's the bottom. And of course, it's probably gathered too much, but I can always let it out, because look at the string. I have all of that to adjust the gathers, and that's what you do once the bodice is ready to be sewn together. So, and then the hem, it still needs to be hemmed. So I'm going to show you how you stitch that corner so that you can do the hem of the garment. So what I'm going to do now, what did I do with my top? I'm going to stitch the top together. And again, I've already sewn the shoulder seams, but in order to turn this, it has to be like this. It has to be like this. And again, the only place I'm going to put straight pins is to hold the seams together to make sure they match up. And don't forget to put your stitch back down to the proper setting. Now on this particular garment, around the edges, it's only 1/4 of an inch. So all of this is matched up. And remember that square stitching? You're going to see the same technique that I used in the square stitching on this. I back stitch and I'm going to the end. And remember, I had to walk it. I walk it to the edge, and then I'm turning it. Now, we didn't do the circle stitching, but this is basically why it's good to practice. If you've never sewn, sewing in a circle, so that when you go around a neckline, you're able to control the machine to go around the neckline. And yes, I did sew right over that straight pin. If your straight pin is at a right angle, then you're able to stitch right over it. If you're not comfortable, take it out. But if it's at a right angle, your needle will never break, or and you won't damage your machine. So now I'm getting close to that edge like I did when I did that square stitching. I pick up my presser foot and turn so that that edge, that corner is right on the corner. And I'm stitching right to the end and back stitching. So now I have stitched all around the neckline of this little jumper, and I am going to stitch around the armhole now. And then if you look, before I do that though, I'm going to put an edge stitching, but if you look, let's see, you can see how my sides, my shoulder seams match up really nicely. But before I sew the armhole, because I want this to look really, I want it to, when I turn it, I want the seam to kind of roll to the inside. So I'm going to show you what you can do. I'm not going to do it in the, I'm going to do it in the front on the inside, but make sure you do this on the part of the garment that's going to be on the inside. All of the seam needs to go towards the front. I'm sorry, towards the back. Because now I'm going to put my machine in, and you won't be able to go to the end, but what you're going to do, and I know this might be difficult to see, I want that thread behind there. It might be difficult to see on camera, but my needle, I put my needle down, my seam is going towards the back of the garment, and I'm going to stitch. Remember when we did the flat fell seam, the mock flat fell seam, and I was close to the edge? That's what I'm doing. It's called edge stitching. And you can take your time. You're not in a sprint when you're trying to do this because you want it to look nice. So take your time, control the machine. You want to stitch close to the edge because you want that seam to roll to the inside, and the back is gonna, the outside is gonna look so pretty. You do this on collars, you do it on cuffs. So now this is as far as I can go, and I'm going to back stitch right there. You could pull that thread to the inside, but really it's not going anywhere because I back stitched. So I'm gonna cut it on the inside. And I'm going to do the same thing in the front, but only a certain amount. I'm not going to do it at the very bottom. And again, I'm edge stitching toward the seam. All of the seam is going one direction. It's going towards the inside of the garment. You don't want it open like when we did that plain seam and we had it flat open. You want both sides facing the inside of the garment, of the back, the inside of the garment. And again, I'm only gonna be able to go so far. But what this is gonna do is cause that seam to roll to one side, and then the outside is gonna be so pretty. So I can only go that far. So I'm back stitching, and then I'm going to do the other side as well. So I wasn't able to go all the way up. You go as far as you can go, and then you stop. And I'm going to show you what it looks like after I do the other side. So I'm going to make sure that seam, both edges of the seam are rolled towards the inside of the garment. And then I'm back stitching. Okay, now what I will do, now I'm going to stitch the armhole. And again, my armhole, because this is all on the inside, it's 1/4 of an inch. A 1/2 inch would be too wide, and actually when you do that, when you use 1/4 of an inch for an inside seam like that, it's also nice so that you don't have to worry about trimming it a lot, because you're basically wasting fabric when you do that. So I backstitch. And because this isn't on an angle, I am going to take my pin out a little when I get around this curve. And I am going to clip around that curve because you want it to lay as flat as it can. And right now I'm making sure both of my seams on both sides of this little bodice, that's what the top of a garment is called. It's called the bodice. So I'm making sure the bodice both seams on the bodice lay open. So I backstitched, and so now I'm going to clip in the part that is curved, and you only need to make little snips. You do not need to cut those big giant diamonds out like some companies used to tell you to sew. So if you look, I've clipped, just snipped it a little in the areas where it's curved the most. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, and I'm going to make sure, and again, my fabric is right sides together, because when I turn it, I want everything on the inside to be concealed like a sandwich. And I'm making sure that my seams are aligned. So that's what I'm pinning, to make sure that they are butted together. Everything should match up. You should not have one side longer than the other. If you stitched, if you cut properly, so now I'm going to stitch the inside, this armhole on this side. I'm back stitching. I'm taking my straight pin out, stitching around the curve, taking my time, making sure both sides of my seams are open so that when I go to turn it inside out, it lays flat. And I feel like children's wear is so easy to make. Some people don't like working with it because it's tiny, but I feel like it's so easy to work with because cotton is the most forgiving fabric. When you start talking about silk and organzas and chiffon, those are the fabrics that can cause you to have a nightmare. So I'm clipping around the curves again. And I'm only clipping the curve because that's the part that I need to be able to work with. So now I'm going to turn it inside out. Before I do the side seam, I am turning it inside out. And if I had my iron, this is the part where you really need to iron. So I'm turning it inside out. I have some threads that I'm going to cut. And I used to cut this part on an angle, but I learned that if I fold it like that, I can get a prettier edge when I turn it. If your fabric isn't thick, if your fabric is thick, you have no choice but to trim that fabric on an angle. But do you see how pretty that, hopefully you can see in the camera, that's the right side, that's the wrong side. And I should have trimmed a little around that curve on the neckline. So I'm going to go back and just do that. I should have done it before I stitched it, and I didn't. So I'm just going to snip it a little because I don't want it to pull. It shouldn't, but just if you do something like that, be careful that you don't cut your garment. Okay. So there. As I could tell that was that in this curve it was pulling a little, and that's because I didn't clip it. That's the importance of clipping. But you see how pretty that looks. So I would press this now before I went on and stitched. And I want to point out something that I did while I was talking, not paying attention. I top stitched it on this side. on the right side. So I've got to take that out. C'est la vie. As surely as you sow, you shall rip. But that's good because I'll get to show you a good way to rip out a seam without damaging your garment. So I meant to do that. And if you believe that, I have a wooden nickel for you because I did not mean to do that. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. This is my outside seam, and I have my top stitching on the wrong side. So this is how you go about fixing something like that. When you've made a mistake like that, if you start pulling the thread, seam rippers are cool, but you can damage your garment. This way, I promise you, you will not damage your garment. Okay, so now that I've pulled that thread, it's called alternately ripping, where I pull the thread from one side and then I pull, I hope you can see this, then I'm pulling on the other side. You do that to seams and you will never damage your garment. There's a possibility, if you're not careful using a seam ripper, that you can damage your garment. And alternately ripping is, it goes by pretty fast. So this is where I top stitched. So that's why I'm having to pull that out. But again, and then down here at the bottom where I back stitched, I'm going to take that out as well. So there, that was how easy it was to take that seam out, that stitch out, excuse me. And so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to top stitch it on the side that it was supposed to be on. So flipping that seam towards the inside. Now I'm going to do that edge stitching on the outside, which is the inside. So making sure that's open. And what I'm doing when you see me adjusting the fabric is making sure that seam is going towards the front. And it's all on one side. Or actually, I'm sorry, going towards the back of the fabric. So now, as you can tell, the outside is correct. And that stitch is on the inside. So now what I would do, and I might be able to get my little iron. Well, I'm going to do it by finger pressing it just to save time. So I'm pressing the seam. And like I said, an iron would be fabulous. That's when you want to press your garment to make it professional looking. And this is a nice cotton, so that's why I'm able to do this. If it wasn't cotton, then I wouldn't be able to do that. But you see how that looks like it was pressed. And then if you look where I put the stitch, that creates a really nice look. But what I am going to see if I could put my little iron on so that I could press this. I just want to see it pressed. So this is a little teeny tiny. This is an infant's dress. So that's what it's looking like so far. That's what it's looking like so far. The top and then the skirt that we gathered. So, but you know what? I'm just going to sew the side seam so that you have an idea, and then we're going to end it there. So now what I would do is take the side seam open, but that's how you turn it right side out to make it where you have the inside and the outside looking just as nice and beautiful. So I'm going to make sure my seam on the inside goes the same direction when I do the seam. I'm going to make sure the thread is to the back on the machine. And now, remembering this is a side seam, so we have a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to stitch this a 1/2 inch. If you make, you always have to make your seams the amount that they were, because if not, your garment is not going to fit properly. So now I'm going to press this open with my fingers. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. And then we will have our top. But again, I'm going to try to press it with my fingers because I'm not going to be able to get in there. This is so tiny. And like I said, some people don't like sewing children's clothing because it's very tiny, and you have to make sure that you're not stretching necklines. So it's always best to sew your necklines first when you're sewing children's wear. And again, I'm making sure that those seams are flat so that when I do press it with the iron, they're open and it's pretty. Okay, so now I'm going to open this and make sure the seam is going towards the back on the front and the back inside, and that my seam allowance matches up. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stitch this. The 1/2 inch that I've allotted. That's not quite a 1/2 inch. That is. And I'm going to back stitch. And I am going to take my needle out, my straight pin, not needle. And I'm back stitching at the end. And I'm opening up this side seam. Okay. So here's our little top. Minus buttons and buttonholes, and then I'm just gonna pin the skirt. I'm not gonna sew it, just so that you could see what it would look like. And again, I would definitely use straight pins to pin. And you're only pinning it to the front. You're not pinning it to the back. And one of the tricks I used to do when I'm working with children's wear like this, to make sure I have the center, because there is a center seam in that skirt, I'll put the side seams together like this, and then just put a little snip to mark the center. So if you can see that, I think you can see it. Let's see. You see that little triangle, inverted triangle? So then I know that that's where the center back seam of the skirt is going to be. Right where I put that little diamond. I do that on women's wear, and I do it on so now this is where you would make sure your gathers look even and pretty. And then I would pin this together and stitch right on top of the 1/2 inch stitch to make sure I have the proper seam allowance. But again, this is where gathering it yourself, like we did comes in nicely and you have nice gathers. So you're going to do the same to the front, to the other side. And that's why I left my thread long, because I knew that I was going to have to let some of the gathers that I had put in out. And I'm putting this seam, the front, right up to the seam of the bodice. And right at the center front, about an inch in, I don't want any gathers there, because that's where the buttons are going to be. Okay. And my pins, I'm pinning perpendicular because you won't injure yourself. Don't pin horizontally on something like this. You want your pins, your straight pins, straight up and down, so that when you're sewing, you're not going to injure yourself. Okay, so I'm going to show you what this looks like. It's so cute. So it's not stitched, but you can see how it came together. So now I would stitch around the waistline. I would hem the end, and I hem my things by hand. So you can see how cute it is. And I have bloomers that go with it. So thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I don't want to fatigue you, so I'm not going to hem it, and I'm not going to stitch the waistline around, but you basically would stitch right on top of the gathered stitch and then turn it inside, and then the outside you would fold it over and stitch from the outside so that it's completely stitched and enclosed. So thank you for joining us tonight. And as we did basic sewing techniques, I showed you books that are oldies but goodies. That one. And again, I do know that the Complete Guide to Sewing, Reader's Digest Complete Guide to Sewing, is out there, but this one is a good one that you might find on eBay. And again, it has everything that you would need. Of course, you could always ask me during the stream any questions that you have, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions. And if I don't know the answer for you at that point, you could drop your email address in the chat and I can get back to you. And we could also do Zoom or Teams or something like that if you have questions that I haven't answered. Again, I know that some people are advanced and I can show you advanced techniques, but tonight I just wanted to do a basic sewing instruction lesson because I find that so many people these days want to learn how to sew and they don't know where to begin. What I taught you tonight If you have a child that I would say is in middle school, 8 years old, maybe they could even handle a machine. These are some things that you could sit down and let them try to learn how to sew, because they basically, I have taught children that were 10 years old, 12 years old, and they actually began to make money with the things that I taught them how to do. One little girl started doing alterations for her mother's friends and made a little extra money. Another little girl made the little massage pillows out with, she made like a rectangle and then stuffed it with rice so that it could be heated in the microwave, and you could put it on your neck, you could put it on your back, you could put it on whatever you wanted to use it for. So thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next week on stream. Take care.